You are listening to the Information Security Innocent Podcast, Episode 14, originally released on July 3rd, 2020. My name is Josh Amishav. This week we have a special guest, Andrew Vanderstock. Andrew's been around in AppSec since the beginning and a little bit before that, so I'm sure this is going to be interesting. Direct support for this podcast comes from BreachSense, the data breach monitoring platform. What's the easiest way hackers break into your network? By using valid usernames and passwords. Hackers collect millions of leaked credentials from almost daily data breaches. Without visibility into which of your employees or users' credentials have been leaked, it's tough to protect against this. Integrate BreachSense's powerfully yet easy-to-use API into your existing security solutions to prevent account takeover and stop online fraud. Andrew, welcome to the show. For those who don't know Andrew Vanderstock, he is the author of the OWASP Top 10, the ASV project, the developer guide, and as of this week, the new executive director of the OWASP Foundation. Andrew, welcome aboard.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Before we start, I'd like to, for those who aren't familiar with you, can you tell us a bit about yourself, how you got into InfoSec?
Sure. So back in the mid 1990s, I was working as a system administrator, and I was very interested. The system administration I was looking at was I was about the system administrator of about a third of my state's health records. That was very challenging and it was interesting, but I was very interested in the patient privacy aspect because electronic records back then weren't necessarily as well protected as paper records. And so, some doctors were at the time trying to sell those electronic records to drug companies and whatnot. And I wasn't interested in that happening. So in the end, though, I went to a party and a friend of a friend invited me to become a IT consultant. And back then, of course, all of InfoSec was based around having a firewall, having TLS or SSL as it was, and that was it. But I was very interested in the patient privacy. My first gig was at the Victorian Electoral Commission. And back, even today, the electoral commissions in Australia, everyone in Australia has to vote. So you have to be on the electoral roll. And to maintain good electoral rolls, you need integrity. And so again, I was very interested in the actual security of elections, and it's still an interest to this day. But the fact is, without application security, it doesn't matter about firewalls. It doesn't matter about SSL. Almost all of my penetration testing over the years has been through firewalls and over SSL. Those controls are important, but they don't actually matter. What matters is whether or not the application itself is secure. And that's to protect data, which then protects people. And so my thing in getting into the information security arena was about protecting people and not necessarily corporations and not necessarily getting deeply into all aspects of information security. I've seen all the fads, but one thing has been
at that point, were there web apps or what? Like, how were the electoral data? How was it stored?
So back then, and I'm pretty sure the system has been replaced since then. The actual thing that did the vote tallying and the electoral rolls were thick clients. And so it was essentially a Microsoft platform. The electoral system at the time had these regional offices where vote tallies were actually combined. They were actually all Microsoft Com Plus components. It was very interesting. But I think that technology's day has passed. I would imagine today it would be a web-based app. I would be very surprised if it was still thick clients.
Wow. That is a very, I guess, historical look at where things were and how far they've come.
Yes.
Okay, so then how did you get your start with OWASP then? So you were doing this work, and then
Yep.
OWASP was created, I think, in 99 or 2000?
2001.
2001.
Plenty of people claim to be at the very beginning of OWASP, but I know the three people who were. So Mark Curfey, Dennis Groves, and one other gentleman whose name escapes me at the moment. I'm going to kick myself. They were in Mark's flat. And quite frankly, if you're not at Mark's flat at that time, you weren't at the very beginning of OWASP, and I wasn't there. it was close, I wasn't there. What had happened was back in 1998, I was asked to do my first code review. And back then we called them mobile apps because they were mobile, because they were web, but it wasn't mobile apps. It was just because back then ActiveX and Java applets were fairly common. But I was doing my first code review for a bank, and I had to learn a lot of things from first principles. And I'd come across Rainforest Puppy's SQL injection paper. And that gave me the first insight that you could actually discover interesting vulnerabilities by thinking about security controls from first principles. So I took what is now ISO 27000 and worked out what those controls might look like. And that became what I was checking for code reviews. But so by 2001, I had done quite a lot of investigations, but I almost certainly had reinvented many of the things that other people also knew. And that's one of the benefits of OWASP, is that we brought together all of that institutional knowledge that was separate, all of that research that had happened to that point. But when the Developer Guide 1.0 came out, which was the first thing that OWASP worked on, it wasn't the OWASP Top 10, I knew more and I had more things that I was looking for than were in the Developer Guide, so I started helping. For example, we were doing things with LDAP, and I was probably the first person to describe LDAP injection, but I didn't realize that I may have invented it, but I don't think I did. But I was probably the first one to write it down, and I didn't think anything special about it because it was just something I looked at, and it's because we were doing SSO using LDAP. And that was just one of the things that I sort of knew, back in the late 90s that wasn't common, and probably still isn't tested very commonly today.
That's very true. So one of the things that OWASP is, I think, best known for is the top 10. Correct. How did the top 10 come about? And what is its place in OWASP? Like, where's it seen now, as opposed to, like, now I think we kind of moved on. I don't know, moved on, but like the ASVS is probably should be as high profile as the top 10.
Yeah. So the top 10 is downloaded millions of times a year. It is probably the thing that OWASP is famous for. If we had no other projects and we only had that one, we would still think of OWASP as being successful. It is not a standard. That's what the application security verification standard is. However, it is used as a standard. And because it is simple, it's only got 10 things in it. The reality is it's got 43 CWEs. So it's not quite 10 things. There's 43. Stealth. We're putting things in by stealth. No, the reality is the top 10 got going in 2003 with Dave Wickers and Jeff Williams. They had decided that they needed to have something simpler than the Developer Guide. They put it together. It's been very successful forever. And I was responsible for the 2007 and 2017 version, and we're working on the 2021 version now.
Okay, and where do you get the data that you used to create it?
Yeah, so in 2003 and 2004, which were the first two versions, it was literally Dave and Jeff decided what was in it. There was no community consultation. It was just, these are the things that we think are important, and they were basically right. The reality is, ever since then, in 2006, when I was preparing the 2007 top 10, I changed the methodology. So we actually looked at vulnerability data, and we got one of the very first data dumps from the guys who run CVE, and they categorized many of the CVEs with what we call CWEs, the common weakness enumeration, and we did some data work on that. And that's still an important aspect of the data that we use today. Unfortunately, it's self-referential, because if you have those top 43 CWEs, if you like, people look for them, and therefore they report them, and therefore it'll be in the top 10 again. So this is why the first top 10 and current top 10 look very similar. But for what it's worth, in 2017, I discovered that there was an original top 10, and this one goes back a long time. In 1975 or 6, the very first special publication from NIST was a secure coding guideline, if you like. And in that, they actually had the OWASP top 10. The only thing it had that we didn't have was concurrent stuff. So essentially race conditions, where they were worried about people abusing multi-programming to get through and create all sorts of problems. And you know what? It's still not in the OWASP top 10 today. And yet with multiprocessors, you've got to remember back then we were talking about one single processor on a mainframe running things in serial as batch jobs. And these guys came up with that control. It was amazing. It was incredible foresight, actually. And now Node.js pretends that it's single-threaded, but it's not. All these apps are written with the idea that I'm single-threaded, and all of a sudden, you could be in serious trouble because it's not really single-threaded at all. And people don't pay attention to race conditions, and I'd love to see it in the OWASP top 10, but there's no data for it. No one tests for it. And quite frankly, it's going to be hard to get in there. It's in the ASVs, though.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, that it's not commonly tested for. It's not something that you hear about or read about. So that definitely will be difficult to put in there. Let's talk a bit about the ASVS. So was that, did that come as a result of the top 10 when you need something a little bit more in depth, or how did that come about?
Yeah, so back in 2008, Mike Bobursky and Jeff Williams were working on the ASVS 1.0. It came out in early 2009. I was a reviewer for it, but I wasn't particularly involved in that point. It was Aspect Security's secure coding checklist. So whenever we did a code review, I was working for Aspect Security at the time. Whenever we did a code review, we were using the Aspect Security checklist. It was like 80% of it. Mike Bobursky thought, and quite rightly so, it needed to be something a bit more. The Aspect Security checklist at the time did not have any architectural elements, and realistically it was focused on code review, which wasn't really where the ASVS has ever been. So they extended it, and so it's written as a set of tests. And so the genesis of it is the Aspect Security coding checklist, but it also incorporates plenty of Mike Bobursky's knowledge and insights. And so those guys released it. It became its own thing. I think it's a huge compliment to the OWASP top 10. The OWASP top 10 is a great start, but it's not a standard. The ASVS has always been written and designed to be a standard. It's easy to comply with. It's just got a lot of items to comply. The reality of it is that it's grown over time, and I think it needs a bit of weeding right now, but at the end of the day, it's the right approach for developers, for architects, for testers, for penetration testers, for code reviewers. It can be used in so many different ways. But yeah, its genesis was as a secure coding checklist.
Okay, that's interesting. One of the things that I find is, and you talk about weeding things, like you'll have certain things like, say, remote code, like remote, if you're including remote JavaScript, right? So, and you don't use an SRI. So then if it's a checklist, should that only check one box that it's because it's missing, or you end up checking like 8 or 9 because it falls into many different categories?
That's always been a problem. I've always tried to make each individual test be a single unit or integration test, because if it ends up being multiple tests, it's actually multiple items you're testing for. And that's actually what we had to do with the virus stuff. In file handling, it was originally very simple. You weren't supposed to be able to upload hostile files. And so the first one had all of these things bundled together as a single control, but it would have been many different things to actually comply with. You would have needed multiple tests. You would have needed multiple input files to test it. For example, you would have needed iCar, you would have needed a zip bomb, you would have needed all of these different things, and they are different tests. I want to make sure that any test is a single test. And that's why it grew, because we split things out. And then once you split them out, does it belong as a configuration item, or does it belong as a coding item? And so the way I looked at it was, if it's anything to do with DevOps, where an operator can change something and the code doesn't need to change, it belongs in configuration. But everything else, it's probably something a developer can take care of and therefore write a test about. But it's actually rather difficult because, for example, memory issues cover so many different elements, from malicious code through input validation through like file handling. Where does it belong? It can be rather tricky.
Okay, so what? So for the future, can we expect to see less tests in future versions?
I want to. At the moment, we've got over 300 items. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for most of them. Doing the basic research to actually prove the efficacy of the control that we suggest hasn't been done. I think this would be a really good grad project for a university PhD thesis. The number of times that this industry has hand waved and said, this is the best way of solving it, that they may not be developers, and therefore there might be alternative ways that are better, and that's not documented. I think we really do need to have developers put their 5 cents in, but I would like to see evidence on, is this actually exploited? And if it is exploited, is it actually important? And that test being used to weed out items that are less important. Every test we put in there that people have to comply with takes away time to actually do good testing across a smaller number of things that may be more impactful. For example, I think there's a lack of integrity items in the ASVs, things that make sure that records don't change in an unauthorized way. I would like to see more of them, but I need to see evidence that it's actually important.
Interesting. Having an evidence-based standard is incredible when you have enough body of evidence to make those decisions on. I want to talk a bit about your new role as the executive director of OWASP, especially in light of COVID-19, which I think is going to. I mean, think of the changes in terms of the conferences, in terms of everything. What are your plans, and what is the future of OWASP?
So this is one of those things where I have to be careful because I am not the board. The board sets the strategic direction. We have to change. I'm going to produce some things that I think are really important for OWASP. If we just simply try to preserve what we have, like go small for a couple of years and then just start again doing conferences and things, I think we've missed the boat. We have to evolve OWASP. And I think the correct direction for us now is we need to change what OWASP is, which is like literally, here's a book, here's a huge PDF, you have to do this entire thing. Developers don't do that. Developers look at Stack Exchange, they use tools, they have languages and frameworks. We need to redevelop OWASP and build it out as DevSecOps first, automation, providing things developers can use straight away, things that testers can use. I'd love to see the testing guide, for example, being rewritten as a set of tests, as a reference package, so that people can take it and use it in their code. That would be huge. But to do that, we need grants. And I think this is where we've got to change. At the moment, the vast majority of OWASP's income up until COVID was conference-based. Whether it's local, regional, or global events, that was the primary source of funding. Membership wasn't a huge component of it. Advertising was never large. We can't sustain our operations by expecting to run in-person conferences for at least 2 years. But if we only take this opportunity to survive, I think we've missed our boat. Because if you think about it, in 2 years' time, DevOps and DevSecOps in particular, will have moved on. And OWASP, all of its materials, all of its projects, all of its standards are very much focused on the development practices of the 2000s. And we need to move into the 2020s. So I want to use this time to rebuild OWASP in the form of developer-centric DevSecOps and get funding from various sources to make that happen. Historically, we haven't paid project leaders. I think we need to have some grants tied to outcomes, such as redeveloping things in a way that would actually help. And I think that would help the foundation projects and developers, and that's where we need to go. Fundamentally, we still want to run events, but we should change to a virtual model. And I don't know that we'll ever go back to having huge events like we used to. That changeover has to happen. We're already doing it with virtual AppSec days. You can actually get training today at the end of July and in August with some of the best trainers in the world, but it'd be remote. I think that's the model for the future. I think as people realize I don't actually need to attend a physical site to get the training I need, I think that's the model for us to go forward. We don't need to just run it once a year. We should run it all the time. So for now, particularly since COVID is so poorly managed here in the US, I would imagine that even if other parts of the world get back on their feet sometime in 2021, you may not let us come. You may want us to go into quarantine for 2 years. For 2 weeks, like they do in Australia. If you're going for a conference and you have to do quarantine for 2 weeks going in, do the conference, come back, do 2 weeks of quarantine, and then you can go back to work. Yeah, no employer is going to do that. So I think for a period of time, we have to be honest, it's going to be a long time before we can hold events of the size and scale and scope that we used to. And so for the meantime, we have to redevelop our ways. And I think by the time this is finished, going back to having huge in-person conferences may not be viable or desirable, and may be poorly attended just because people know there's a better way now.
Yeah, it'd be great to see conferences, like online OWASP conferences and days would be great, and especially you don't have the physical you can attend as a great speaker somewhere in France, and just aside for the time zone, you can have access to a lot more information. I want to ask you a couple of personal questions.
Yep.
What skill set would you like to would you want to improve in?
I want to basically improve in coding. My background was software development when I did university. I did not graduate. I'm learning Rust at the moment. That's an interesting language. I spent some time on Go. I think some of these systems...
Go with our hotness now. So,
yeah.
What made you go with Rust?
It's got a really interesting memory allocator. So it's actually, for the most part, it's type safe, and it's also quite hard to do buffer overflows. And so it eliminates an entire bug class. And for a systems language, that's amazing. But I prefer Go. I think Go's got a greater future in web apps and mobile apps than Rust. I think Rust is probably going to be... I was seeing an interview today with Linus Torvalds, and he's looking at device drivers written in Rust, and I think that's a tremendously great idea. I think that's going to improve the state of Linux security tremendously. As a security person, I think everybody who's involved in application security should learn how to code, and the best way of doing that is to continue doing projects that interest you in a language, not just watching YouTube videos or something. You've got to code. So that's really important to me, and keeping my skills up to date.
Okay, what contrarian view do you hold that, and why?
So this will make me a bit of a pariah in many parts of the information security world, but I don't like a lot of the controls that we put in place. The anti-consumer, and I think we could, if we just tried a little harder, we'd be a lot better. So, for example, back in the mid-2000s, we were involved in setting up SMS authentication for transactions in internet banking. One of the things that I was really, initially a bit scared of, but actually proved to be quite correct, the business folks wanted to up the daily limit. So you were doing this additional security, but you also got this benefit. And I think we need to do that a lot. So, for example, with passwords, I want to see passwords die. The ASVs is already moving along that pathway. The OWASP top 10 is moving along that pathway. Things like password rotation and complexity just have no place. They're not effective controls. They've never been effective controls. For example, in the original 1978 paper that proposed them, they actually did say, this is not an effective control. You shouldn't really do this, but you might want to just change passwords every 30 days because we were able to crack passwords on a PDP-11 in 31 days. That's where that came from. It's insane.
Actually, what the one pushback that I don't want to say consistently get, or that I could say that I get questions about, is when, based on the ASVs recommending passwords be at least 12 characters, and the question always like, wait, the recommendation is supposed to be 8. Would you get 12 from? So that we need
to fix inconsistencies like that. I'm actually not too fast if it's 8 characters if you're using two-factor. I don't think that's an important number. It's about making sure that if your password is breached, you shouldn't be able to be in trouble. The reason why we made it 12 is we can use rainbow tables on anything less than 12 characters and brute force in a reasonable time today. That's the same advice in the NIST 800-63. And I think we need to have different limits for different types of programs. And different limits if you're using multi-factor. If you've got, like, my password is Harry the Dirty Dog, that's a simple password to break. if people know that you use words. We need to basically have evidence-based password controls that are realistic for the people who are trying to use them. What we're really trying to encourage with that is actually adoption of password managers. I use them extensively. I have 460 unique passwords. They're all 25 characters plus. Except for the places where it still have password complexity rules. Good luck cracking that password, but please don't restrict my passwords at length. So I don't know that it's contrarian. It's becoming more of a mainstream view, but at the end of the day, I think we need to be more consumer friendly. That's the only way that we're going to get adoption of these, the security controls that are actually important.
Now, in 2030, are we going to still be using passwords?
Oh, I hope not. We're seeing a lot of places using magic links to sign in. I think that's a good thing. Windows Hello works really well. I like that. My iPad lets me log in using my face. That works less well in COVID. So I do think we're probably going to rely less on them. I really do hope that people have the ability to use something like FIDO, where the passwords are not really there anymore. And people rely upon a smaller number of critical passwords or accounts, such as, for example, Gmail's often used as SSO. If people secure the Gmail account properly, the rest of the things that rely upon that are also protected. So I would love to see a situation where people are relying upon these SSO logins that are quite secure. It's one of those things where it's going to take time. Plenty of people worry about, I've got services in the cloud I don't control. I can't possibly do that. As more and more cloud adoption occurs, I think running your own authentication server does make a lot of sense.
Okay, and the last thing I wanted to ask is, we always share a tip or a skill on the podcast. What can you share with us?
The one question I'm asked quite frequently is, how do you get started contributing to OWASP? And the way I got going is that I knew things that weren't in the current materials. And so I just started writing bits of it. For example, I knew a lot about session management at the time, and I had lots of tests for the session manager. And so I started putting them in. And by the time I finished putting that in, I was already a contributor. And so I was able to get used to the materials. So with OWASP, I think the important thing is to gain trust. And that is contributing over a period of time. So for that, I think get used to what the project's about. Like, pick a project that you're actually interested in. There's no point in working on something you're not interested in. Pick a project you like. Ask what could be done simply. Like, many of the projects on OWASP actually do have, this is a starter question or whatever in GitHub. Pick one of those, do it well, contribute, and then as time goes along, your contributions will be more and more trusted, and then you'll get really good at being part of that project. And I think that's how most of the project leaders are there today, is they have contributed over a period of time and became trusted. So if you want to be a community leader and there's no local chapter, start a chapter and invite people to come along, and it will build up over time. If you make mistakes in the early days, you'll only have 3 or 4 people who are going to be upset with you. I started the Melbourne and Sydney chapters, but then promptly wasn't in Sydney for the next 4 years. And so these things are still there. If you go to the OWASP Sydney page at the moment, you don't see a lot, but the reality is there are 130 people there. So this thing I started many years ago and didn't even look after well is still going. So think about just attending a chapter. If you don't have a chapter in the area, start one and see if anyone else comes. I think that's a really important thing. But yeah, contributing with open source communities, it's about trust. Build up the trust by doing small things often and do them well. And take feedback in the way it's provided. Plenty of people in the open source community are a bit rough around the edges in providing feedback. They're trying to make things better for everyone. Worst comes to the worst, you don't like the original version, fork it. Almost everything on OWASP's GitHub is, either GNU licensed, or it's, the common, like the CCSA, the share alike license. Just fork it and make your own. That's how the mobile application security verification standard came around. They didn't like what we were doing, and so they created their own. And it's taken a life of its own. It's different. So yeah, go for it.
Great. All right. This is great. And thank you so much for your time. If someone wants to reach out, has a question for you, what's the best way to contact you?
Many different ways. I've been on the internet for 30 years, so easy to find. Probably the easiest way for me personally is through Twitter. I've got open DMs, and from time to time I do check message requests just to make sure that I haven't missed anybody. It may take me a while to notice you if I'm not following you, but I do try to look at that every day. Also, my email at OWASP is vanderaj@owasp.org. That's a good starter way. My email address at the staff email address is much longer. I'll point you in that direction if I get any of those queries. But yeah, I'm going to try and get it to be shorter.
Twitter be the way then.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much. And this has been great. And just want to wish you best of luck in your new position as the executive director of OWASP. So that's it for today. If you have any questions or feedback, please contact me at podcast@breachsense.io. The show notes are on breachsense.io/podcast. And if you got value from this episode, then please share it with a friend. See y'all next week.